In most conversations about the American Civil War, there's one perspective that always seems to be conspicuously absent. In the endless arguments about the cause of the war, which side had the better generals, what would have happened if Jackson had been at Culp's Hill, there's a ghost at the feast. Let's be real. These types of conversations about which side was better, the Union or the Confederacy, are primarily being had among white people. Yes, my friends, I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but checkmate Lincolnites is indeed some white people shit. Among most black Americans, historically and today, there is no doubt about what the central issue at stake during the war was, or what the most important outcome was of the United States victory. It's often said that the Civil War wasn't about slavery until Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 for strategic reasons. But it had always been a war for slavery for the Southern planters who seceded to protect it. And more importantly, the people they enslaved recognized it as a war for liberation from the very beginning, and they took action accordingly. By the time the Emancipation Proclamation took effect, Southern slavery was already disintegrating, primarily due to the resistance and sabotage done by enslaved people. The outbreak of the Civil War was the opening black Southerners had been waiting for centuries. With so many plantation owners and military-age white men away at war, the Confederate home front was vulnerable, and enslaved people exploited that weakness gleefully. They refused to follow orders. They stopped working. They emancipated themselves by the thousands and headed for Union lines. They formed militias and political organizations. In one Kentucky town in 1861, enslaved people even marched in the streets shouting hurrahs for Lincoln and liberty. And as soon as the Union Army came close to an enslaved population, they oftentimes openly rebelled, seizing control of their enslaver's house, eating his food, and wearing his clothes. It was only later that, in the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, with perplexed and laggard steps, the United States government followed in the footsteps of the black slave. But this was only the first stage of the servile insurrection which would crush American slavery. Once the Emancipation Proclamation explicitly turned United States forces into an army of deliverance, formerly enslaved people, free people of color, and white abolitionist radicals worked together to compel the federal government to form the United States Colored Troops and send 180,000 black men down south to destroy the slave republic of the Confederacy. The USCT infused the Union Army with fresh troops and morale at a critical point in the war, when Northern public opinion was increasingly turning toward peace and compromise. But in the fight against slavery, there could be no compromise for Black America. Now, I'm sure I could sit here for hours and ramble to you about all this stuff, but I think I'd rather draw on the thoughts and opinions of a few experts in Black American military history. This past Juneteenth, my good friend Carl Casarda of In Range TV and I were invited to the Buffalo Soldiers Museum in Houston, Texas, to see some lectures and presentations about black soldiers in the American Civil War. While we were at it, we filmed some interviews with black Civil War reenactors who were an absolute wealth of hidden history and underappreciated knowledge. So on this very special episode of The Abolitionists, we'll be hearing from them about how the movement to abolish slavery in America actually succeeded.
Yeah, the slavery was definitely the 8,000-pound gorilla in the room when it comes to that conversation, right? And it's not just from the Civil War. I mean, it goes back to the Revolutionary War too, right? So you think about our motivations, like there were, anywhere up to 5,000 to 7,000 Africans that served the Patriot side during the Revolutionary War, and people ask, well, what's their motivation, right? Same thing on the British or Loyalist side. There were anywhere from like 12 to 20,000. What was their motivation? Freedom. Slavery is the 8,000-pound gorilla in the room. We cared about freedom. We were an enslaved population. We were dragged from Africa. We had, some folks of African descent that sold us into slavery, right? Wars were instituted in Africa, a lot of times by Europeans to make sure that it brought a steady flow of slaves. Many of us are descended from prisoners of war. So there's even a kind of a warrior culture in some of our heritage, because these are people who fought wars and some of us lost, and we ended up becoming slaves. It was scary for the enslavers to have us together if we spoke the same language. A lot of times that was specifically focused on. We want to separate these different cultures, because yes, if we spoke the same language, now we could fight you. That movie Amistad, I thought was a great example of that. When they start chanting way o two, they're speaking the same language, and these are big, strong people. These are warriors, so yeah. And servile insurrection was one of the biggest fears, especially in the South, because we have slave patrols that were set up in order to be able to prevent that. Little military organizations that young white men were forced to think poorly about African. They didn't even have a choice because many states in the South said, okay, you have to serve as part of this military organization that's a slave patrol, and you need to be able to demean people of color and ask them if they're free or slave and demand a pass. And of course, even if you were somebody who wasn't raised with slaves, immediately you think this person is lesser than you because you have power over them. And you're taught that servile insurrection is something you need to suppress brutally. No wonder they thought it was okay to massacre U.S. colored troops after they surrendered during the Civil War. You've been taught your whole life that these people are below you and that they need to be stopped. And that if they are armed, that they are dangerous.
What I found out in my time doing the Civil War reenacting, specifically with United States colored troops, is that they're involving themselves in a war to save the Union, with the understanding if that's the way that they're going to gain emancipation, enfranchisement, equality, equity, inclusion, and even education, this is what they're going to have to do, right? So their agenda was emancipation first. They just realized they had to save the Union in order to get that.
But it's interesting that when the Civil War breaks out and when this sort of great opportunity for emancipation presents itself, everybody in the abolitionist movement, whether it's Martin Delany or Frederick Douglass, everybody kind of goes toward this one goal, which is like, yes, let's use the federal government, let's use the United States Army to essentially, bring freedom, to our, fellow man. So that's really interesting how kind of all these different kind of strategies in the 1850s focus on this one strategy in the 1860s that ends up being successful. And, one thing that Eric Foner in his book about Reconstruction goes over at the beginning when he's talking about the effects of the Emancipation Proclamation is this idea that, for the white North, it was all about preserving the Union, but for the black South, from the very beginning, from Fort Sumter, it was like, this is a war to free us. We're going to free ourselves.
Slaves resisted in many different ways. By just refusing to work or to work as hard. Sometimes poisoning masters. Sometimes it was there were slave revolts. But that form of resistance has been around for generations, and it's not even just an African American thing. It's literally, you can trace people who have been enslaved for generations doing that. But it was part of the resistance to make the powers that be felt that we were content. It was a form of survival. And then they thought less of us, and they didn't expect us to be doing things like listening, when they're talking about plans. And now many of us are becoming spies because we're hearing them. Oh, these Negroes aren't going to care about what we say. We're their masters, right? But we're listening, and we do a very good job at listening, and we're able to communicate that to Northern troops when they're coming through the different areas. So there are many forms of resistance that go above and beyond just using your weapon, and before we became the United States colored troops. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation enabled that slave revolt. It freed all slaves and states in act of rebellion against the U.S. It made the entire Union Army an army of freedoms wherever it went. Juneteenths were literally happening everywhere, in Tennessee, in Virginia, in Mississippi. Wherever the Union Army went, slaves were freed, and now they had the opportunity to join the organization that was designed for the recruitment and training and arming of those troops, the United States colored troops of the American Civil War.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's interesting how much the Confederate planter class, the Confederate government and the Confederate military fretted about servile insurrection, and specifically, in kind of the feverish, months of the secession crisis, when they kind of said the quiet part out loud, and a lot of saying, obviously famously Alexander Stephens sort of getting up in front of crowds in Georgia saying slavery is the cornerstone of the Confederacy. They fretted about servile insurrection. It was their worst nightmare. But at the same time, they also had this narrative that was, but our slaves are contented and happy, and they enjoy their work, and we're helping them. And so there was this sort of contradictory idea in their mind. But what I find really fascinating is that even though the Confederate planter class seceded to protect slavery in response to Lincoln's election, what they didn't count on was the enslaved reaction to that.
Right.
Was the fact that so many enslaved people, amounted to, I mean, they sort of enacted what was sort of almost what you could call a labor strike.
Not everybody was
Yeah,
enslaved,
yeah.
but the majority of the United States colored troops were taken from, if they weren't from a position of enslavement, they were taken from a position of you were a runaway, transitioned into your life as a contraband, and then became a soldier, or contributed to the United States colored troops. And so, I'm talking to people like everybody knows what I'm talking about. I just want to clarify, when I use the term contraband, those were the runaway enslaved people that transitioned to freedom by becoming a refugee laborer. They followed the military, they cooked, they cleaned, they pretty much did all the functions supporting the military. They weren't actually military jobs. And those ended up becoming, most of those recruits in the United States colored troops were contrabands. They were recently the term is self-emancipated, enslaved people,
Well, and they probably, some of them, a lot of them did like similar jobs in the Confederate Army when they were enslaved, like as teamsters and cooks and stuff. So they, but obviously there would have been the possibility for advancement in the Union Army.
Now, some of them I always forget, because I always talk about it from the point of view as, from enslavement to being a soldier, and I say that they were self-emancipated, but there is a portion of them that are actually being seized as property and brought into the military. I know a lot of Confederate guys, they people with Confederate sympathies, they'll say, see, there's somebody's listening to this now, say, see, they did the same stuff that we're, look, most of the time, these people are self-emancipating, and they're volunteering themselves into service. However, we do see cases where the U.S. military would go from plantation to plantation, and they would say, look, we're going to give you some money to free your person, because it's inevitable. They're going to end up, see, especially as we get closer to the establishment of the Emancipation Proclamation, they're telling them, like, I can give you a little bit something now for your loss. It's basically a reparation to the slave master, right? Like a buyout, I'm going to give you something, because if you wait to the end, you probably won't get anything at all. And I just want to be on good terms with you, so that way you don't decide to flip on me and decide to be Confederate sympathizing, right?
I can speak from the female side of things. We are often completely ignored and neglected and just non-existent. Like our records, if you look up Black records for USCT in general, like women aren't even on paper. We're listed as unknown. And so when for example, when it comes to compensation and pay, we did not get compensation. At least the Black soldier got $10 a month, $7 after they paid for their equipment, because they thought they were too irresponsible to pay for their own stuff and take care of things. But we got nothing. So you mean to tell me I have to do your laundry, I have to cook for you, I have to cut into your body and save your life for no money at all? I'm an amalgamation. So primarily what I normally represent is a captain in the Union Medical Corps as an assistant surgeon. So I like to show and highlight the side of Black females. We weren't just cleaning up slop and blood and cooking for everyone and doing laundry. We literally would do brain surgery. We would cut off limbs. We would save soldiers' lives, Black and white. And I also talk about Harriet Tubman and Susie King Taylor, and how I was taught under them, and women like me, herbal remedies that would actually be more life-saving than the pharmaceuticals that they would force us to use. And how it went back to our African roots, that honey that was passed down from generation to generation. And then we get to mix in Native American herbal remedies along with Mexican, since we're down in Texas, the Tejano community, how they took us in after we were freed, and allowed us to go into Mexico, and they helped remind us what we were at our core, how we were more than just property. And they allowed us to come in there, and we mixed and commingled together, building up their community and then building us up in return. Hospitals, schools, literally clinics, and we would share our medicines, we mixed bloodlines, and we supported one another.
What was the experience of the formerly enslaved person who joined the USCT versus sort of the free Black Northerner joining the USCT, and kind of what were the different motivations from these people?
Yeah, definitely. Well, if you're a Southerner, I mean, you were literally might have just been freed, and you may have relatives on other plantations that may have been sold away or just further away where the Union Army wasn't able to reach you, that you were literally trying to free. So I love hearing the story of a battle called Milliken's Bend. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of that. That took place during the Vicksburg campaign. And when you hear the Vicksburg, like they never mentioned the black troops that fought there. But this was June 7th, 1863, and a bunch of white obviously the Emancipation Proclamation has happened, and a bunch of white recruiters are going around to all these plantations in Louisiana and Mississippi trying to recruit freshly freed slaves. And not a lot of them are like thrilled about it. They don't trust these white men that are coming out and talking to them, but they get this black guy, and his name is Jack Jackson. And I mean, I think I'm a pretty big dude. I'm about 6 foot, 215 or something like that. I think he was about as big as me, if not bigger. Bald head. Maybe he had been an overseer when he was on the plantation, but he was somebody that like commanded attention. And they start bringing him out to recruit. And some of these slaves are not super thrilled about joining. Many are, but the ones that weren't thrilled, he's yanking them like, "Come on, you're coming with us," right? So, and they form this black brigade that fights at this Battle of Milliken's Bend, where they're like poor, they haven't even really been trained. Some of them barely know how to fire their weapons. I think they had been in the military service for about 3 weeks, and they're attacked by a Texas brigade of cavalry who also didn't have combat experience, but they were pretty well trained. And they fought them pretty much to a draw on the Battle of the Levee at Milliken's Bend. And it was like one of the most brutal fights, bayonets, rifle butts, cracking open skulls. Black Jack Jackson, as they say, was one of the most terrifying fighters during that battle. He was very dangerous with the bayonet. He killed and wounded a lot of people, but they made a special note, the Texans, to shoot him at the top of the levee because he was big, he was imposing. Yeah. But they ended up driving the black troops who had never really fought before almost to the Mississippi River, and then the Union gunboats came and knocked the Confederates out of position. And they ended up winning that battle. So it's one of the earliest battles of the USCT. But I think the point I was trying to make is it's a different experience, right? Because you're coming just off the plantation if you're coming from the South many times. And of course, you could have been a free man of color too. There were free people. But maybe you have family members that were still enslaved. Maybe you were a slave owner technically because you bought some of your own family members, right? You hear people get look at the blacks, they own slaves too. Yeah, many times they're buying their own family members so that, they can remain with them and not be sold somewhere else.
I was so excited to see the beginning of this presentation. I couldn't watch the whole thing because I had to be everywhere at once, but he began with the story of Jacob Dodson. And I don't know if you know this man, but he's one you need to study when it comes to understanding what was going on prior to the United States Colored Troops, because this man, he essentially raised 300 men that said he took the self-initiative to basically raise his own unit. The longer story is that this man, he is phenomenal before he does that. He's a black explorer out west. He's doing the same type of work like Lewis and Clark. He goes out there, he comes back, I guess he's saying, there's got to be more. Yeah, like, yes, I'm free or out here in the Western frontier, but there's got to be something more I could do for my own community. So I believe that he was doing almost like servant work or janitorial work or something like that on Capitol Hill. And he's trying to do that like unofficial lobby work, like he's sweeping and cleaning or being a butler to somebody and saying, "Sir, can I get that tea for you? By the way, why I'm here. Is there any word when African Americans will be pulled in?" I mean, yeah. I can find guys. He's already got them. He's got like 300 guys ready to go into the war. Yeah. But because of the race issues and the debates are going back and forth, they were like, "Yeah, we're gonna table that, and please, actually, don't even tell anybody that you got guys raised. People, us innocent white folks are gonna get scared. Gonna call somebody have a heart attack knowing that you guys actually have guns and you're ready to jump in. Like, you can't show them that you're doing this stuff, right? But they're just like these crazy examples that I could talk endless about.
Yeah,
this
stuff, for sure.
But look up Jacob Dodson.
There were actually women, both black and white, that ended up portraying and pretending to be male soldiers, even going the furthest extent of black women being male white soldiers. And so, particularly Maria Lewis with Rochester, New York, 52nd Cavalry, all the way up in Rochester. And to this day, up until her death, she refused to have her picture taken. So all we have is a picture of the monument dedicated to her. But she portrayed a white male soldier because she was passable. And I actually have historic documents that talk about how powerful we are as women, Black women specifically. When we were portraying male soldiers, some of us were actually pregnant. And they didn't know it at the time, but we would hide our pregnancy amongst the bullets flying overhead, the dysentery, disease, malnutrition, starvation. And if we managed to get to the point where we were laboring, we would end up going into a field next to our campsite and giving birth in the field. Most of them ended up being stillborn if we didn't have a spontaneous miscarriage prior to. But there's 2 cases documented that I found that actually made it all the way to birth and were live births. But unfortunately, they had to run off because for threat of being killed and losing their lives. But think about that. Like women in general, but especially Black women, what we had to go through and how strong we were. I mean, that's incredible.
Now, from a northern perspective, and I'm a northern boy, I'm from Jersey, the northern experience was a bit different. Being Black and in the north can be kind of a lonely experience. There were some small Black communities that were there, but not always. Sometimes you were just working on a farm. You had been hired out on a farm somewhere in rural New Jersey or Pennsylvania where there were no Black people around. But you were probably descended from slaves, more than likely. And slavery is a part of your life, even though you're not a slave. You're probably treated differently because you're Black, and because when people up north think of Black, what do they think of? Slaves, right? A huge portion of our population was. So I imagine that these young men who joined the Union Army cared a bit about freedom. They might have had ancestors in the South. They understand the stigma of slavery. They probably wanted to defeat that stigma. They probably wanted to prove themselves as men. They probably wanted to make money because people who lived in the North didn't always have the best of jobs. The job opportunities weren't great for people of color, even in the North. So, the Army was giving steady meals and steady pay. There were many reasons. Maybe you truly bought the concept of freedom for the country and preserving the Union. Black people were not a monolith. There were many different motivations that would have driven us to be able to fight. Many people in the North were educated. You hear about Christian A. Fleetwood, who was the Sergeant Major of the 4th United States Colored Troops out of Baltimore, Maryland. He had a college education. He graduated from what would become Lincoln University. He was already running like a shipping company out in Sierra Leone or somewhere in Africa. He was super well. He understood like Greek philosophy and mathematics. He was super smart. And when the recruiters met him, they're like, "You're going to be a sergeant major," like right away, right? But unfortunately, when you talk about the U.S. colored troops, it was very limiting because it would allow Blacks to become non-commissioned officers, but typically not commissioned officers. So even his fellow commissioned officers near the end of the war weren't insulted if Christian A. Fleetwood could have been promoted to lieutenant or a higher rank. They said, "This guy's a gentleman." But unfortunately, because he was part of the colored troops, there was limitations. So in his particular unit, he was not allowed to become a commanding officer. Other units like the 54th and 55th Mass, you do see some commanding officers, and that might be because there were some nuances about a state regiment versus the United States colored troops, which made things a little bit different.
Gotcha. So kind of what I'm hearing is that for a lot of Black men who joined up, this was deeply personal.
Most of these soldiers of color, they're traveling over several state lines to join the one regiment that is closest to them, and that might even be 5 states across. I know I was reading some research of a historian in Poughkeepsie, New York, and he was saying that there were guys from Poughkeepsie, New York, that left New York, that went all the way to Boston, Massachusetts, because in 1862, that was the closest colored regiment. They're doing anything and everything they can to put themselves in a position of self-determination and to earn those things like emancipation, enfranchisement, equality, equity, inclusion, and education. They become 10% of the U.S. Army. And I've heard debates. I've gotten some pretty heated debates about like the Navy numbers, but I've heard it's conservative. Usually I say about 10 to 12% on the conservative end. And some historians, many the the museums like the African American Civil War Museum and the National Museum, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, they make mention of it being up to 25% of the Navy. You know, there's a debate about that, and you guys can kind of look at the literature that's out there, but those numbers are important when I translate it, because I could just be throwing data all day and it doesn't really mean anything. It's just like numbers in the mind. What's important is that 10% and that 10% Army and 12 to 25% of the Navy, they come in at a crucial time when the Army's actually fatigued. You know, and one of the most well-known units is really to kind of get the name out for the United States Colored Troops is the 54th Massachusetts.
Yeah, absolutely.
When they stormed Fort Wagner, we talked about people having race issues on both sides of the war. There were, you know, even to the point when they allowed them. You know, that scene out of Glory when they're talking about the pay issues and how they start them at $10 a month instead of
very
13.
accurate scene.
The 13, this is the stuff that they're dealing with because of their race, right? But they turned the tide of the war at the most fatigue hour, and in that same process, they saved the nation. They earned emancipation, enfranchisement, equality, equity, inclusion, and even education for their people. It's important that we remember that even though those things directly impacted the African American community, but it actually took them who were the bottom rung of society and started to bring them higher on the ladder, so those rights and privileges would be distributed among everybody in society.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, it's important I say that so I can bridge this information to other people. They understand this actually relates to you as well. You know, someone who's Polish, Irish, whoever comes through Ellis Island,
you know,
or a woman,
yeah.
you know, they're coming through a place like Ellis Island, or they're establishing, you know, women's suffrage a couple decades later. There's no question of what their rights or privileges are, because the man and women of color, which I didn't talk about, they put that time, energy, that sweat, that blood, you know, they made that sacrifice to make that change, not just for the community, but for everybody.
Yeah, and it is the first time in American history that you do see that happening, right? It's just like specifically black men through the USCT, through the, you know, getting the franchise, you know, that is kind of the first major breakthrough of like a non-white male landowning, you know, person kind of being sort of led into the in-group of American society.
Black women, Black people, we built this country on our backs. Don't forget that. And you guys would not have all that you have as non-Black people if it weren't for all of our sacrifices.
You know, it's important to understand that these personal kind of motivations, right, they are Black people taking agency to kind of bend the forces of history to their will. So, but oftentimes you don't hear about Black Jack Jackson. You don't hear about these stories. You know, at best, you'll hear about the 54th Massachusetts, which is, of course, an amazing story, but it's, you know, still white officers. You know, it's sort of, it's kind of something that's kind of the pet project of kind of the white Massachusetts sort of urban elite abolitionist movement. So I'm curious, why don't we hear more of these about more of these unsung heroes and about more of these sort of unapologetically Black stories in traditional narratives?
Yeah, definitely. We'd love to hear more about it. You know, there were some Black troops that wrote, like I can think his name is Corporal Gooden from the 54th Massachusetts. He kept the diary. Christian A. Fleetwood was super well educated, like I mentioned. But then you have some other men who really didn't write as much, so that kind of prevents it. And then, of course, I mean, there's the typical bigotry that prevents the narrative. You know, that doesn't want a narrative of what we did during the war, right? I mean, after the war, you have the whole Lost Cause movement. And that really tried to paint the Union Army as the bad people and the Southern Army as the good people, and we were just completely erased from the story. We were benevolent, we were happy in our enslavement. I mean, look at Birth of a Nation and movies that are so well praised. I get it; it has the whole, you know, a context of being the first for this and the first for that. I understand, but I mean,
Gone with the Wind. And...
Right, these were horrible depictions of people of color, and our ancestors kind of just had to eat that. You know, right? Our great grandparents, you know, who we try and, hey, tell us about our history. Well, they're thinking about stuff like Birth of a Nation and, you know, Gone with the Wind, and they don't really want to talk about it because history to them is sad. There's PTSD that comes with it. History for them was surviving. right? So I think that's what kind of blocks the narrative, but we try and control the narrative. You know, right now, especially with you have the political situation, you have what's called a story war. And they think someone like me, who I consider myself to be patriotic, I love this country, I was born here, I can trace my family back a couple hundred years in this country, and probably more if they cared about black people then and listed us as people on the slave schedule. So it's very hard for me to go before 1820. Maybe I have ancestors that served in the Revolution. I'll never know because no one cared about my ancestors. But I'm proud to be an American. My dad served this country. My grandfather was in the Korean War, right? I talked to you about my ancestors that served in the Civil War. But because I talk about my culture, about the black portion of our history, I'm woke. I'm something to be scorned and looked at poorly. No, I care about this country, but I also care about my history being told because I'm someone and my ancestors were someone. I'm the hope and dreams and prayers of those people. And they were here and they did wonderful things. And as Americans, you should care about it.
Well, I hope you enjoy those conversations as much as I did. Thank you again to Kevin, Alexis, and DC for sitting down with me, and a huge thank you to Cale and Jason at the Buffalo Soldiers Museum for being such good hosts. The Living History Encampment was, bar none, the least toxic and most fun Civil War reenactment I've ever been to, and the Juneteenth after party was an absolute gas, with all vegan catering from a black-owned soul food restaurant. What are you guys trying to make me fall in love with you or something? The museum is closing soon for renovations, but will be open again next year. If you're ever in the Houston area, I highly recommend you check it out. And I'd also like to thank my Patreon supporters for making this trip to Houston possible. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like it in the future, I hope you'll consider joining us on there. My patrons get all sorts of benefits. Lower tiers get text and photo updates for a glimpse behind the scenes, but the real high rollers get extra videos. For $20 a month, you get access to a whole backlog of making-of featurettes, audio commentaries, and outtake reels. Come on, you know you want some Johnny Reb outtakes. A gentle slave driver is still a slave driver. A gentle slave driver is still a gentle slave driver is still a slave driver. A woke slave driver is still a slave driver. A woke slave driver is still a slave driver. I also recently added a new Patreon tier, the Black Republicans tier, where if you pay $100 a month for 12 months, I will buy you a drink in New Orleans. If you can get your ass down here, that is. And it'll be a bougie drink, like absinthe or something. Stay spicy, folks. See you in the next one.